Hey, everybody, if you're watching, we're going to start soon, but stick around. Scott Hartwig's on.
Aggregate, and a little bit later we'll actually see a
All right. Anybody in there, Chris, yet? Does it say?
No one in here yet.
Okay, all right. So it's the middle of the day. People have jobs, unlike us.
I'm like,
They got stuff to do. All right, so we'll get it started anyway. Ready? Here we go.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we are talking with our friend Scott Hartwig about this big thing. I dread the thought of the place. It's the second volume in his Maryland campaign series. And welcome, Scott.
Good to be here, Matt.
So how long when did you start doing both of these?
Well, the first volume,
Pull that mic a little closer to you. Sorry, I should have given you that instruction.
the first volume, To Antietam Creek, was that was about a 20-year project.
20 years.
Yeah.
So while you were working here at Gettysburg National Military Park, you were kind of working on that on the side?
Right. Raising 3 kids.
Yeah.
Doing all the stuff that everybody does. And so it was actually kind of a joke in the Park Service amongst friends in the Park Service. The joke was Hartwig's working on this book on Antietam, and as if that is never going to really happen. Because, when I worked at the park, I had the park library as part of my duties to take care of. And I had a lot of researchers that would come in there. And, for every 20 or 30 or 40 people that came in who were researching and were going to write a book, maybe one did.
Okay.
So a lot of people say they're going to write a book. Well, anyway, I was slow and steady. So when I start something, I'm going to finish it. It might take me a long time.
Right. But it wins the race.
Yeah.
Slow and steady.
Yeah, so that was a long one. This one, I started in 2014.
Jeez. Uh-huh.
And I finished it in 2022. I'm pretty sure it was 2022 I finished it. Because it takes about a year when you finish a book like this. It's about a year's project to do all the work that you do to get it into publication. So they'll have a couple of readers who will read through it, and then the readers may come back to you with some things that they suggest that you look at or revise or expand upon or whatever.
Now, are these readers historians?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So at Johns Hopkins University Press, they ask me for a number of names, and that's the way a lot of presses work. University presses, they'll ask the writer for names of people, and if you're responsible, what you want to do is you want to get people who are going to be critical. You don't want somebody to go, wow, this guy's the greatest thing in the world. Yeah.
Right.
No, you do not want that. You want somebody who's going to be critical who also knows the subject really, really well. So I had 2 readers on my book. They were both really, really good and had some good suggestions in there. So you make some revisions in that, send it back in, then they send it to a copy editor, and then that takes several months because the copy editor sends you the chapters, and then you go through the copy edits that they make, and then, there might be questions about stuff that they have in there. So it just takes a little while to do that.
Are those more like grammatical and punctuation and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And also to make sure, that, you speak with the same voice throughout the whole thing.
Yes.
They kind of unify it all just in case. Because when you work on something over a long time period,
your voice changes.
You can. Yeah, you can do that. So you want to make sure you keep the same voice. So you finish with that, and then there's a lot of little detailed things that you got to take care of to make sure that the formatting is right for what they're doing, and then there's some other process that I'm forgetting in there. But then ultimately it leads to the biggest nightmare of any of these books is the index. So the index, and when you get the index, what usually happens is the book is ready to go to the printer. So they have only a limited time. So it's not like they can give you the book and say, okay, you've got 4 months or 5 months to index it. Usually what it is they'll be like, you have 4 or 5 months or 4 or 5 weeks to index the whole book. So you got to, and if you don't get it done in that time, then they don't publish the book when they plan on publishing it. It'll get pushed back. So you don't want that to happen.
Right.
You got to bust your butt and get that thing done. Now, I did not do the index by myself. I am not that crazy.
Right.
My wife, her sister, and a good friend of mine, Eric Fisher, who helped me. Eric Fisher and my wife helped me on the last book. We all took a chunk of the index, and so
walk me through that process though. So what do you have to actually reread the book and then tick off every time someone or something is mentioned? How does that? I always wondered how they index books.
Well, the way you can do it now. It used to be you had to go through the book page by page.
Right.
But now when you have the whole document in the PDF, so let's say I'm going to index the 45th Pennsylvania Infantry. So I'm going to type in 45th PA and 45th Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So you put both of them in there. You have to make sure you put both in there. And you
Sure.
might just put 45th in just to make sure that
Yeah,
you get them
yeah.
all. And then you're going to go through and you're going to see where the 45th Pennsylvania is mentioned. And if it's somebody big, like let's say you're doing George B. McClellan in a book like this, well, then you do have to go through it. You look at all the references to McClellan. There's going to be hundreds of them.
Sure.
And then you look at how he's referenced. So is it maybe about McClellan's, decision on not renewing the attack on September 18th? Well, that's a separate category in the under the McClellan head, McClellan in the index. So it's a lot of that is a judgment call because some people I've seen in their indexes, I mean, they break it down. I don't know how they have the time to do it, but it's unbelievable. It's great because you can go right to things that you're looking for.
Right.
And then you'll find indexes where all they do is they'll say George B. McClellan, and you'll see like 300 pages.
Right.
And there's no breakdown.
Yeah.
So
now you got to go find what you're looking for.
You have to look through every single page. So what I tried to kind of split the middle. I didn't do as much of a breakdown as some people do, but I did a breakdown so that for the major things I thought, what you're always thinking in terms of is somebody who's using this book in a scholarly way, or maybe they're writing a paper or something like that, and they want to know about Edwin Sumner in the Battle of Antietam. You're going to break it down in there so that these are the most important things I think about Edwin Sumner and the Battle of Antietam.
Right.
And these are the categories that he fits in. So it makes it a lot easier for the person who's trying to glean that out of the book.
Yeah, okay.
So but it takes a lot of time. It's not a fun process.
I would imagine that would be the most frustrating part because you finished the whole freaking book and now you've got to go back and make note of where you mention everything that you mentioned.
But the one thing about the index that I found to be really interesting is the index also speaks to, like for example, I realized as I went through the index, certain artillery batteries that you see feature prominently in the battle, and then you'll find some artillery batteries aren't even mentioned. So they're present on the battlefield. They don't do anything.
Okay.
They're not even engaged.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I noticed is that the Confederate batteries in the battle are really heavily engaged, almost all of them. The Union Army, there's a fair number of artillery batteries who don't do any firing at all and don't do any fighting. And then there's others who do a tremendous amount. So what that teaches me when I look at that is I'm like, they didn't make effective use of all of the weapons that they had available to them.
Right.
They held a lot of them back, and there were places on the field they could have used them. So the index sometimes can make you realize, trends that might have occurred during the battle that you weren't aware of when you were writing the book. So there's some definite value to doing the index.
So 20 years it's taken you to do this. There had to be times where you didn't touch it for months or maybe a year or two, right?
Never a time I didn't touch it for a year or two.
Okay.
A time I didn't touch it for a month or two. Like when I was doing the first book, during this July, I'm not doing anything on it. I mean, or June, for Memorial Day. Like a lot of times when we're super, super busy at the park, I did not have time, or I just didn't have any energy by the time I got home. And, my two sons were both in Little League and Teener League, and my one son was really involved in soccer, and then my daughter was doing softball and a bunch of other things. So there was always, in the summertime, a lot of things going on. Now, this second book, that I had a regular schedule. So that book, writing that book was my job.
Okay.
So I'd get up, take the dog for a walk, get home, I'd work on the book the rest of the morning. Sometimes, certain days of the week, I would work on it in the afternoons. Other days of the week, I go to the Y in the afternoon. But you find that you can do about 3 hours is the max that you can really dedicate to writing and researching and thinking and being creative. And then after that, you start to lose your edge.
Yeah.
So you better just stop. And pick it up again the next day. But the thing is, if you have a regular schedule, you will be amazed at how much you get done.
So I've always wondered that because when I started this whole thing, I started writing what I call narrative episodes, where it's a narration and I do music and sound effects and other people reading quotes and stuff. And, you know, so you got to research it, you got to write it. There's a lot of creativity involved.
Right.
And creativity for me is something that you either have or you don't.
Yeah.
I can't do it on a schedule. When I do it on a schedule, the work suffers.
That's right.
And I've been in a writer's block for 2 years now. I can't
happens.
because what's happened in between was when I started it, this wasn't anything, and I hadn't put anything out yet. I had another job. This was on the side. It was my passion, you know. But then once it becomes my job, and there's all these other components to it to keep all the balls in the air, you don't have the time. Or, as you mentioned, the energy to sit down and write.
Right.
Because it takes a lot. Like, you got to kind of like spill your guts, you know?
Right.
It's a laborious process. So, but you found, though, but you know, you're saying that for the second book, you were retired.
Yeah.
So you had all the time in the world.
I did.
So it's easier. It's just like, this is my one thing I have to do.
Right.
And work out. Right. So like, and the working out is good because that keeps everything going, right? You got to do that.
Yeah.
So I could see that, you know, I'm not retired, so I don't have that luxury yet.
No, exactly. And that's why, I mean, you know, the first book, it took 20 years and it was a really, you know, that was a really hard process because I went through periods where, and I wrote in the evenings then.
Okay.
And, you know, there were some evenings you'd sit there and you just stare at your computer screen for an hour.
Right.
And maybe you'd get a sentence.
Yep.
But sometimes if you were able to get that sentence, the next night you got 2 paragraphs or a page.
Sure.
Because the sentence broke the logjam.
Right.
But I've never met anybody who doesn't, even people that I'm amazed at what a great writer they are. I've even read about them. They're like, they have writer block.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes they just can't. But it's also... It's like musicians, you know, you'll have somebody who turns out this phenomenal album and then they become famous and there's all these demands on their time and they don't have the creative time anymore.
Yep.
That was one of the things that, you know, that I love dog walking is when I be walking my dog, I'm also involved in the local theater. So if I wasn't rehearsing my lines for a theatrical production that I was in, I was going over in my mind the chapter I was working on and thinking about what I was trying to say with it and what was going on and what I'd been researching. And a lot of times just having that period where you can just be walking and you're out in the park and there's nobody around and you're with your thoughts and your doggy, a lot of things can come to you. And then you get home and then you know, you can start writing and being creative because you've had that. It's kind of like a refueling period for your creative part of you.
Does solitude help you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I am the opposite of my mother. My mother, who will turn 100 years old next week.
I met her at the book release. Yeah.
My mother thrives on being around people. You know, she comes alive.
Yeah.
It drains me. I like people, but if I'm around a lot of people, it just drains me.
So you're naturally an introvert?
I'm kind of a little bit of both.
Okay.
I mean, if I'm around people, I can certainly be extroverted. I've done, you know, programs for hundreds of people over the years. But I like solitude. I just don't want it all the time.
Yeah. I'm the same way. It is draining, you know, being on.
Yeah.
And then it's nice to be alone.
Yeah.
And just shut everything out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you finally finish it. So I'm reading through the chapter about the West Woods and just all the moving parts. Now, I have to admit, I'm not as well versed on Antietam as I am Gettysburg, so it's all pretty new to me.
Yeah.
Getting this deep into it, right? But I've always wondered this about people when they write these histories with, you know, all the regiments and the men in the regiments and the accounts and everything. How do you find them all? And how do you keep track of them all? And like, I want to put this in here. Oh, I got to remember to put this. Like, what do you do? Do you have a wall full of Post-its, or is it all in a computer? Like, what's your process like?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. The process that evolved, and I think it evolved by like the third chapter in the book. When I started the book, I would pull out all my files. I would pull out all my books. I would pull out everything that I had. I had stuff on the computer, and I had stuff scattered all over the room. And then you're looking around. You're like, well, where was this? You're driving yourself nuts, right?
Right.
Because you just saw it. I just saw it in this book. I can't find it. So then you're looking around for like 40 minutes,
Yeah.
right? And then finally you find it, and then you've lost all your thoughts about which one to write. Anyway, so it was a very inefficient process. So what I came upon was, I said, you know what I'm going to do? It's going to take a lot of time, but I'm going to create a notes chapter, I'll call it. So I'm working on, let's say, chapter 3, and this will be notes to chapter 3. And then what I would do is I would go through every single document that I had, the official records, all the other stuff that I had, every document that related to that particular chapter. And when I would look through that, I would look at an account. Let's say I'm looking at an account from a guy from the 97th New York or something like that. And as I'm reading through it, I would look at what is the essence of this account? What's the most important part of this account that I would want to have? And I would type it in.
Okay.
The entire thing. Now, I might end up using a sentence out of that account for a quote.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately what would happen is I would organize the notes, if it was a chapter about the battle, by order of battle. So I'd have Union, Confederate, and then I would go through by Corps. So if there was anything I might have from a Corps commander, Hooker, let's say, any documents about Hooker or from Hooker or whatever, then down to the division, brigade, regiment. So you had the whole thing organized. It made it very easy when you were looking for something like a specific area on the field or a specific action, and you knew what units were in it, you could go right to it. And it also had everything in one document. So it was a lot of work. I mean, for example, I think one of my notes chapters that I did for one of the Sunken Lane chapters was over 100 pages.
Wow, Jesus.
Right. So it was a lot of work, but it made the writing so much easier.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It made it
just
so
have
much
it all
easier.
in one place.
It's all in one place. I didn't have to go looking around. And then the other thing is you got the search function. So there's no more of, where did I read that quote? I know that quote's in here. And you're looking through this book, and then it wasn't where you thought it was in the book. Right.
Yeah.
So when you have the search function, then I could just go right through. I could find the unit, or I could find the quote that I was looking for. And that really made the process go well. But it might take me a month to finish the notes for a chapter.
Okay.
But then, rather than it taking me, say, 3 months to write the chapter, I might write the chapter in a month.
Okay.
So maybe you cut a month out of the whole process of doing this. So that ended up being a really efficient way. And I did it through the rest of the book. So I did it in all the aftermath chapters, the chapter about emancipation, when McClellan gets removed from command, the Confederate, all those. I did it for every single chapter, and it just was so efficient. It was such a really efficient way.
I don't think people realize just how much work goes into doing these things.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
It is a lot. Even if you were doing one that's a 32nd the size of these two volumes, it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. Yeah.
Now, when you set out to do this, I mean, of course, you worked at Antietam, right?
No, I never.
You never worked there.
No. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I feel like I've seen you in some old History Channel show about Antietam, though.
I was in a couple, and I was in the film they used to have at Antietam that Brad Graham made.
Okay.
That was down there for over 20 years.
Yeah.
Tom Clemens and I were kind of the, not Noah Trudeau.
Joseph Harsh?
No. I just forgot his name. He wrote the great books about the Overland campaign. That'll come to me.
Okay.
Anyway, Gordon Ray, Gordon Ray, and Dave Finney also were hosts on that. So we were all hosts on this thing.
Got it.
That they Brad Graham donated to Antietam because they allowed Brad Graham to film on the battlefield, like the Sunken Lane section when they used reenactors was filmed in the Sunken Lane. Some other things that they the Burnside Bridge section. So it was a really good. I mean, it's dated now, and they're replacing it down there now.
Yeah.
But during its time, so that some people thought maybe I worked at Antietam because I had appeared in some of these.
Yeah,
things,
I was
but
always under that assumption. So, but is Antietam your favorite battle? I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, this is addressing Gettysburg. Everybody loves Gettysburg. Listens. They love the other battles too, but we associate you with here.
Yeah.
And it's, for some people, perhaps a heartbreak to think that you would spend all this time on another battle. But is it your favorite battle? Why'd you pick Antietam?
I wouldn't say I have a favorite battle. I would say that I decided I wanted to write about Antietam. And where did that come from? I think it may be where it originated. And people have asked me about this. I'm like, I think where that originated was Bruce Catton, Mr. Lincoln's Army.
Okay.
So when you read the section about Antietam in there, the thing that Catton keeps driving home is all these officers who are writing that it was the most intense fire they ever faced in the war. Now, some of them, it was up to that point in the war. Some of them, it was in the war that they'd never experienced anything like that. And for some reason, Antietam always stuck with me from when I just kind of knew a little bit about the Civil War. So I wanted to write about it. And the other thing I wanted to do with this is I wanted to tell the story of a campaign and a battle in as complete a fashion as I could. And one of the things about Antietam that made that possible is Antietam may be the best documented battle of the Civil War. Now, I know that sounds insane for me to say, having worked at Gettysburg.
Right.
But I believe Antietam is better documented than Gettysburg.
By the participants, you mean?
Yes.
Or okay.
But here's why. After Gettysburg, our best, other than the wartime sources like the diaries, the letters, newspaper letters, et cetera, that the soldiers and the participants, civilians wrote, the best source that we have about the Battle of Gettysburg are the Batchelder papers. So Batchelder was going to write the history of the Battle of Gettysburg, and he corresponded with hundreds of veterans to get their reminiscences about the battle. Now, if you're a veteran, and John Batchelder, who wasn't a veteran, even though he was called Colonel John Batchelder, was kind of an honorary title for him, and he knew more about the battle than anybody alive.
Okay.
A lot of veterans of the battle said that. They're like, nobody knows the battle better than John Batchelder, even those of us who were in it. But if you're a veteran and you know that John Batchelder was writing the history of the most famous battle of the war, might you be prone to tell some exaggerated stories or put yourself at the center of things? Or
Yeah. Okay.
That kind of mars some of the correspondence that Batchelder got. So at Antietam, you had two ex-soldiers, John Gould, who was the adjutant of the 10th Maine, and Ezra Carman, who was the colonel of the 13th New Jersey. He was here at Gettysburg as well. And Carman became the government historian of Antietam, and all of the tablets, the government tablets that you read at Antietam, like it'll say, Lawton's brigade was 165 yards east of this point, and blah, 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 and you're like, oh my God, how did they get all of this detailed information?
Right.
Well, Ezra Carman got it.
Okay.
Because Ezra Carman corresponded with men from every unit in the battle, every unit.
North and south.
North and south. And he went out on the field with a lot of them.
Okay.
And they would measure distances. Yeah, this is where we were, blah, blah, blah.
Oh.
So John Gould, Joe Mansfield, the commander of the 12th Corps, was mortally wounded in front of his regiment. In fact, John Gould helped take Mansfield off the field. And there's a controversy about that whole thing that's kind of ridiculous. I refer to it a little bit in the book because other units claimed that Batchelder was shot in front of them. But Gould's documentation is really, really good, and it's contemporary to the battle. And but afterwards, after the war, I think it was in the 1880s, Gould wrote an account for a soldier's newspaper called the National Tribune, and he described the death of Mansfield. And then he got this response from these guys in the 125th Pennsylvania, which was a 9-month volunteer regiment. and Antietam was their first battle.
Yeah.
In fact, they were 3 weeks from home. They had almost no training. So they said, "You're full of it, man." He was shot in front of our regiment, and we carried him off the field.
Huh.
So Gould's like, pretty sure I was there.
I'm pretty sure I remember.
But he was like, okay, you know what? Let's find out what did happen. So he said, I'm interested in hearing from people. So anyway, this started Gould, who had a very curious mind. He was a banker in Maine after the war, but he had a very curious mind. And he wasn't a historian, but he was a really good historian. So what he would do is he started corresponding with veterans of other 12th Corps units. Then he started corresponding with men from the 1st Corps. Then he started corresponding with Confederates. And to get an idea how he worked, like let's say he doesn't know anybody who served in the 4th Alabama. He may have learned that the 10th Maine faced the 4th Alabama in these woods. So what he would do is he'd find out where the 4th Alabama was raised, and he would write to the postmaster in one of those counties, and he would have a letter that he would say, the postmaster, any veterans of the 4th Alabama, could you please share this letter with them? And the letter was asking them a series of questions about the Battle of Antietam and what they remembered about the battle. But he didn't just say, like, hey, you know, I'm interested in what you remember. He had very specific questions that he asked them about their experience in the battle. And it was amazing, the response that he got. Everybody wanted to talk about it. They would write him. So he got all these guys from the 4th Alabama, for example, who ended up writing him and telling him their reminiscences. And the interesting thing was he was a true Yankee and believed in the cause that the Union fought for. But he kept any political opinions he had completely in check. He just wanted to know what had happened and who had done what. And the Confederate veterans came to trust him. They trusted his quest for the truth. So they would tell him what they really had experienced. And the other thing that was great about these letters is a lot of times they would write about other people in their unit, superior officers who'd made blunders or mistakes and things like that, because he was another veteran. This was a private letter.
Right.
He's not writing a history of the Battle of Antietam like John Batchelder's writing the history of Gettysburg.
Okay.
So a lot of these veterans ended up being really, really honest with Carman and with Gould. And Carman and Gould both knew each other, and they shared stuff with each other. So, and then Carman ultimately wrote a 1,300-page history of the Maryland campaign, which Tom Clemens, who lives down near Antietam, he edited that, and it was published by Savas Beatty 3-4 years ago. So it's a great book. It's 3 volumes. So anyway, you have all this documentation, and then Carman did this series of maps. A lot of people make a great deal about Batchelder's maps.
Right.
He did these maps that were kind of hour by hour. But if you really study Batchelder's maps, his maps that are on the beginning of the battle in the first day are pretty good. But as you go through his maps, you realize he never finished them. His maps are really, in a way, drafts. Carman's maps that he does of the battle, which are kind of hour by hour, he did a whole set in 1904, and I cannot believe how much they spent on this. They shipped these maps, which are huge, these huge maps. They shipped them out to a whole bunch of veterans across the country to verify whether the information in the maps was accurate. So then they would write Carman, and they would say, no, we should be over here a little bit more, or that fence was here, or we were over there. Anyway, and he did another set of maps in 1908.
Okay.
So those are the kind of like the maps of Antietam. But anyway.
The Batchelder did that, but it was still during the war, and he never did it again?
He did his maps in the 1870s. He did a map on each day of the battle, and those maps are pretty good. They're really super detailed, but there's only one moment during the day on July 1st, July 2nd, July 3rd. Then he did a series of maps where he was trying to show the movement of troops throughout the battle. Those are the maps, I think he did them in the early 1880s. Those are the maps that, when I examined them, they looked to me like draft maps. Because I had to go over those when we were working on the new museum. We had interactive exhibit in there, so you could go in and look up any unit that was in the battle, and you could find out where they were on the battlefield each day of the battle, and then we had to pick a time of day that they would be, because we couldn't show all the positions, and then we'd have other info about where were they raised, how many casualties, et cetera, et cetera. So I had to use Batchelder's maps really carefully, because I did the verifying of where everybody was at a specific time of the day. And I was really amazed at how many different units, sometimes they weren't even on his map.
Really?
Or sometimes it was clear he wasn't sure that that's where they were. He hadn't been able to verify. He didn't have the information to verify that. So, I mean, it's not to take anything away from what Batchelder did, because I think Batchelder was a really good historian and did a lot of amazing work and is really responsible for a lot of what we see today at Gettysburg National Military Park.
Sure.
It's just that Gould and Carmen were much more systematic in their process that they used. So when you're working on something like this, I mean, you just had this fantastic resource that was available to you. And, that they didn't cover, I mean, there were certain little gaps. Like, for example, Richard H. Anderson's division of Lee's army. It's very poorly documented. And in fact, Carmen wasn't able to find a lot of stuff from that particular division. Or maybe he did and it wasn't saved. But we just don't. It was a really beat up division to begin with. And there may not have been a lot of men who survived the war to be able to write about it and remember it. So you do have some places that there are some gaps that we don't have as good a knowledge as we'd like to have in Antietam. But overall, I just say Antietam, it is a better documented battle than Gettysburg. And it's not as big a battle as Gettysburg.
That's right.
So
It's one day.
It's one day, and tackling Gettysburg in the way I wanted to do Antietam, because at Antietam I wanted to get into the weeds.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted the people to both understand Lee and McClellan and the high-ranking people and the decisions that they make, but I wanted them to also understand the little guys that, have all forgotten and what they experienced in the battle, because that's the heart and soul of the story. It's kind of like, I was thinking about a metaphor the other day, is that if someone was to write about a history of Woodstock, and they didn't write anything about the music.
Right. Yeah.
You're missing a big...
Sure.
You're missing the vital ingredient of what was Woodstock. So if you're writing about a battle and you're just staying at the commander's level, you're not really telling the story of the battle.
There was one part, I can't remember the regiment, but it's Union regiment. They're going into the woods. And there's two soldiers, I think, that the colonel had a problem with, or an officer, I don't remember.
It was the captain, yeah.
Captain had a problem with, and one of them started vomiting.
Yeah.
And the captain's like, I figured he swallowed his tobacco to make this happen, so I just kept prodding him along with my sword.
With a sword.
But I really like that detail, and I'm sure there's millions more like it in all the books, because it humanizes everything.
Yeah.
You're right, like. And it's funny how history, the study of these different things has changed over the years. Because when I started getting into this stuff, it was very much commander's level and the 30,000-foot view and everything, which I kind of like. I'm a big picture guy to begin with, right? But as I started doing the show, more and more people I'm finding in the audience are interested in the nitty-gritty. They're interested in the individual soldier's experience. And so, well, you got to give the people what they want, right? So I start doing shows about that, and I find it actually is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think we all try to, put ourselves in their shoes, but we have no clue unless you've been in combat. You have nothing to go off of. And so to hear these stories, and when I saw that you put in that this kid was vomiting, whether he swallowed a plug of tobacco to make it happen or not, doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
Because I would have been vomiting anyway without the tobacco. I know I would be. I couldn't handle that.
Yeah.
And you think you're going into the woods, and I'm looking at the map of all these troops. And I've been in the West Woods, and they're not ginormous. They're they're decent size, but thousands of troops in there. I mean, it had to be such a mess.
Yeah.
and you're going into it, you know, you're marching over the dead and wounded and debris of the earlier fighting,
Right.
and now you're going into this noise that you can't see. You just, you know, you're just hearing all this noise coming from
Yeah.
the woods. You're seeing all this carnage on the ground. It's got to be terrifying.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted to have stories like that in there, is that his name was Sam Hodgman. He was a captain in the 7th Michigan. And
Yeah, that's right.
one of the things I get really tired about, or tired of, in it's not just, it's military writing in general, is there's a lot of glorification of veterans.
Yeah.
There's a lot of times the people who are writing aren't veterans, and they tend to glorify the veterans. Everybody's a hero, and they want to bring out all the heroic things that everybody does, and oh my God, the sacrifices that they've made, and so on. And I look at them as they're the same as any other generation would be who got thrust into this circumstance. They didn't want it. They didn't want it. They didn't want to be. Sam Hodgman didn't want to be prodding a guy with his sword across the field. That wasn't something that he aspired to do in his life.
Sure.
With 2 terrified soldiers who he knew weren't very good soldiers because they'd bugged out in other battles. And he's like, you're not bugging out this time.
Right.
And I completely believe that he was right, that the one guy swallowed his tobacco so he'd start throwing up, because he is terrified at the thought of going into this fight. I wanted to tell the stories of people who were incredibly heroic and people who were cowardly. But I also wanted to make sure that people understood, like another individual in the book who I'll always remember is Alexander Hoo, Hooe. He was a captain in the 6th Wisconsin. Really, really good regiment. So Alexander Hoo is a great, what the Army today would call a great garrison soldier. So Alexander Hoo, his father had been in the Army. He'd grown up on military posts. He knew Hardee's Tactics, which was the tactical manual that both armies used, backwards and forwards. He could train soldiers really, really well. So getting his men ready for war, Hoo excelled at it. When the real bullets started to fly, Hoo couldn't perform. Hoo was terrified. And he performed very badly in the fighting around Second Manassas. A lot of his men took note of it. They wrote about it. And then at Antietam, he is ordered with another company to form the skirmish line for the regiment. And they are the spear point of Doubleday's division, the 6th Wisconsin. So those 2 skirmish companies are the very, very front of the 1st Division's attack down the Hagerstown Pike. And the other captain was a guy named John Kellogg. And Kellogg was a prosecuting attorney in Juneau County, I think, Wisconsin, before the war. No military experience. He just was a natural leader. And he conquered his fears. Everybody's afraid.
Sure.
I guarantee Kellogg was afraid. He conquered his fears. He did his job. He was really effective, really good. Who hides behind a tree in the North Woods. And what do you think his soldiers are going to do? Keep going forward?
No.
So soldiers are like, they just hunkered down.
Yeah.
So his company had 1 man wounded in the Battle of Antietam. And for a regiment that lost almost 50% of its men. So
Wow.
So Who, after the battle, is forced to resign by the colonel, Edward Bragg, and he goes home in disgrace. But here's the interesting thing about him. If you read any published things about the 6th Wisconsin, nobody mentions his failure. His failure. They'll mention Who.
Oh, okay.
Nobody mentions his failure at Antietam. So you might go, well, that's kind of interesting. Well, that's because I think real soldiers who really understood the psychological impact of combat, like Rufus Dawes, who's the major of the 6th Wisconsin. Dawes understands the line between what he does and how he performs and what happened to Alexander Who is a fine one. And I'm not going to publicly criticize this man. I will privately write maybe to John Gould or to Ezra Carman that this guy, failed, or in a private letter home. I'm not going to do it publicly. So you find that a lot of times soldiers were very forgiving of individuals who did not perform well, who shirked their duty. They didn't like them necessarily, but
Right.
it wasn't as if everybody was really upset, because a lot of times they were like, I wish I could run away.
Yeah.
But something is, like, there's another guy, when you get farther in the book, his name's John Rankin, and he's a sergeant in the 27th Indiana. And he wrote this just fantastic memoir of Antietam. And he writes about how when they come under fire, they're just north of the cornfield, that he is waiting for the first person to get wounded so he can carry him to the rear and get out of the fight.
Yeah.
And he talks about the psychological struggle that he has to stay in the ranks. And he's a sergeant.
Yeah.
He's an NCO. He's not just a private. And I find those stories, to me, that in a lot of ways to me is really true courage, because that's the way a lot of people are. Like John Rankin, they just don't want to be here. They want to be out of this. They want all the accolades of being this famous, tough veteran. But the reality is, when the bullets start whacking against people's bodies, you're like, I don't want to be the next one.
No.
And if I can find an honorable way to get out of this, I want out. So in the regiment right beside them, which was the 3rd Wisconsin, they had, I think, 7, 8, it could have even been 10, I can't remember, color bearers who were shot. But every one of them was wounded, and most of them were wounded slightly. But the moment you got a wound, you could hand the flag to somebody else honorably.
Right.
Honorably.
Yeah.
And go to the rear.
Yeah.
And no one would think anything of you. It's the rare person that you find who gets shot 3 times and then maybe gets killed, who stays in there. Like, there's another story from, he was the color bearer of one of the Pennsylvania Reserves regiments, and he gets wounded at South Mountain. And some of the guys in the regiment say to him that night, after the battle is over, and they're kind of getting into their camp, and they're like, "Hey, so and so," I forget his name. They're like, "Why don't you go to the hospital?" And he goes, "When I have a reason to go to the hospital, I go to the hospital." They're like, "Oh my God!"
Wow.
And then at Antietam, he says, after he says, "When I have a reason," he says, "The bullet's not molded that can kill me."
Oh, one of those guys.
He gets killed at Antietam.
Oh.
Incredibly brave man.
Sure.
But those sorts of individuals are the exception, not the rule.
Right. Yeah, we'd like to think they're all.
Right.
Anybody who puts the uniform on is that way.
Right.
Right. But they're all human beings at the end of the day.
Yeah.
There's another story, and I can't remember, in the woods. I can't remember the regiment, but he talks about how the guy to the left of him is 22, might have been a shoemaker.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the guy to the right of him is 19. They're getting hit.
Yeah.
There's a guy in front of him down on the ground.
Dead.
Yeah. And he's still loading and firing, and he was quite proud of himself that he was able to do it. And I remember I was reading that last night on the couch, and I stopped and I read the passage to my girlfriend, and I put it down. I go, I just can't imagine, with all of the bullets flying around, how everyone doesn't get hit.
Right.
I don't get it. And I have a theory that, because it's not like they're miles apart. Yeah, there's the smoke and all that stuff, but you can. I would imagine you could still make out a human form at some point, you know. But my theory is that you just don't want to. You don't want to hit somebody.
That's the case with some people. I think with more people, what it actually is that when you're being fired at, it is a rare soldier who is taking careful aim, firing back.
So it's just load, bang, bang.
It's pointing in the direction the enemy is. But I'll also mention that as you go through the book, you'll find numerous references from soldiers who say every man in the regiment had multiple bullet holes through their clothing and their equipment.
Yes.
So, for example, this John Rankin, 27th Indiana.
That's him.
Every soldier in the 27th Indiana, every soldier in the 3rd Wisconsin who wasn't hit in the body were all hit by bullets that hit equipment on them or their clothing.
Didn't one hit his rifle?
Well, it might have.
I think
yeah,
he
it might
was
have.
one of them. Yeah, I read
Yeah.
about that somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, so in a lot of cases, some soldiers who come out of the fighting, like there's a soldier I was just reading, I was looking over some of his chapters last night. He was in the 34th New York, which fought near the Dunkard Church in the West Woods. And they were a veteran regiment. They fought really hard. They just got overwhelmed. The Confederates maneuvered really well against them, and they took 50% casualties. And this guy got out. Now, he had one bullet, I think. It singed his ear.
Singed.
And he writes after that night, he's writing about, I just felt bewildered. That is a very common feeling that a lot of these soldiers have. They're trying to come to grips with what they've just experienced, and they can't yet because it's so overwhelming to them. All these things that they've seen, all this violence, all this trauma. Why did I survive?
Right.
Why am I alive?
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm alive. I because there were so many bullets flying. I just can't. Like Ezra Carmen, Carmen rides back to Sharpsburg in early October, I think it is, of 62. So it's about 3 weeks after the battle. And he goes back into the West Woods near the Dunkard Church where his regiment was about 12 o'clock on the 17th. And he's looking at the trees in the woods where his regiment was. And he's like, when I'm looking at the trees, I don't know how any of us got out of there. There's so many bullet holes in the trees. So
but that's the other thing I was thinking, that the woods must have looked a mess. I mean, those trees had to be just shards.
Well, I mean, they were really pockmarked. It was mostly mature oaks and maybe some hickory in there.
Okay.
So they were decent sized trees that were in there.
Okay.
So they can take a licking, but I mean, there are a lot of accounts of soldiers saying, these artillery shells would come through and they would just knock off huge branches off some of these trees, and then they would fall on the men. God. It happened to Knapp's battery. They sent a section of Knapp's battery into the woods in a really stupid move. Not the fault of the artillerymen, the fault of the infantry commander. And they had a shell cut a really big limb, and it fell on two of the horses and pinned the horses to the ground. So they couldn't get the gun out. So, I mean, sometimes that happens.
That's a huge limb if it's pinning horses to the ground.
That's a big limb.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So you're talking about the guys, they're bewildered that, they survived and having witnessed what they witnessed and everything like that. But they're not all green troops. These are veterans, right? I mean, they've been in. They were just in Second Manassas, southbound. You mentioned. So, like, what was so horrendous about Antietam that they had this reaction, or was this the reaction after Moses? Because look, you know a lot about Gettysburg. Do you see that reaction after Gettysburg as much as you do at Antietam?
Yeah, you do. I mean, I think it's the reaction after Antietam is the reaction you get if you're really in the middle of, a tough, really tough fight. Like you're at Gaines's Mill, or you're at Second Manassas, or you're at Glendale or Malvern Hill. The experience is really jarring for anybody who's in that. If you're on the fringe of it, it's different. You have a completely different experience. So you can go to the Battle of Antietam and you can find a guy in the 5th Corps whose experience of the battle was pretty benign. I mean, he was basically an observer to the battle. Whereas a guy in the 6th Wisconsin, that's a big deal. I mean, he's really in the thick of the fighting there. So anyway, I just forgot where I was going.
Well, we're talking about the reactions that they have compared to Gettysburg and other battles.
The thing about Antietam, though, is a lot of the battles that they had been in, even at Manassas and particularly in the 7 Days battles for these soldiers who were veterans, they'd never been able to see as much of the battlefield as you could at Antietam. And the scale of the slaughter was unnerving. So even a soldier, as tough a soldier as Nelson Miles, he becomes the Chief of Staff of the United States Army I think he was chief of staff like in 1904. I mean, he goes all the way up into the 20th century. So he's at Antietam. He's second in command of the 61st, 64th New York. They combined the two regiments because they were both a little bit under strength. Francis Barlow is the colonel, who's, an unbelievably brave guy. I mean, almost kind of crazy. And like, he's one of those rare birds who he might be scared, but he likes it.
Right. Gets off on the
He likes
thrill.
it. He likes the thrill.
Yeah.
Nelson Miles is just tough. He's just a tough dude. But he writes a letter after the battle to his brother, and he's like, you don't ever want to see anything like this.
Really?
Like, there's no like, oh man, isn't war glorious? He's like, oh my God, I can't believe we did this. We human beings, we did this. This is just unbelievably horrible. He's like, as far as the eye can see, there's dead bodies everywhere. And there's a lot of soldiers are shocked by the scale of the violence. Even, when you're talking about Sedgwick's division, if you were in the 1st Minnesota, the regiments that were on the far right of the leading brigade, Gorman's brigade, when they pass through the East Woods, they come out of the East Woods and they enter the cornfield and the meadows south of the cornfield. And in that area, the 6th Georgia Infantry had taken just horrendous casualties. I mean, literally guys mowed down in rows. And a number of these soldiers encounter that. And they're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
One guy writes his brother or his friend back in Minnesota. He's like, look, I know you're not going to believe me when I'm telling you this. I wouldn't have believed it either, but I saw it with my own 2 eyes. He says, there's like laying in rows. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And then Roland Bowen, who's in the 15th Massachusetts, he's writing about, he says, there's just dead bodies and wounded all over the field, all through the cornfield, all through the meadow. And he says, we're stepping over and around these guys to avoid tromping on them.
Yeah.
But that in itself is like, we're going into this?
Right. Right.
Wow.
Because, okay, so for people who are not well-versed in Antietam like me, this is not the beginning of the battle, but it's early on in the morning. But the cornfield has already happened.
Yeah.
And there is Union incursion into the North Woods. I'm sorry, the West Woods already. And so Sedgwick's division you mentioned, they're coming in later, right?
Right.
Because the fighting is already pushed in that direction.
Right.
And their reinforcements coming in to keep it going, right?
Yeah. So there's been a huge battle. I mean, I really want to underscore a huge battle.
Put it in perspective, Gettysburg, like first day?
So from 5:30 a.m. to 8:30 a.m., there were the same number of casualties as all the Union forces lost on July the 1st. So the Union Army lost a little over 9,000 men on July the 1st.
Yeah.
There's over 9,000 casualties.
Total
Confederate and Union in the 5:30 to 8:30 morning fighting. Cornfield.
Oh my God.
East Woods, West Woods, meadow south of the cornfield, that area, there's 9,000 casualties. So
That's amazing.
It is, and so for the Confederates, they had...
Wait, that's 3,000 an hour.
Yeah. So the Confederates...
Oh my God.
The Confederates had 3 divisions and a good part of a 4th division who fought in that area. Every one of those divisions, if you were looking at them as combat effective, were all destroyed in the morning fighting. On the Union side, you had 3 divisions of the 1st Corps, 2 divisions of the 12th Corps. The 3 divisions of the 1st Corps were all really beat up. They weren't destroyed. They were really beat up. And the 2 divisions of the 12th Corps had used a lot of ammo. Some units had taken a lot of casualties. They were kind of beat up. They were kind of scattered. So they were not like this sort of unit you would use to spearhead an attack. But what had happened is the entire Confederate left flank had collapsed when Sedgwick comes on the field. And the Confederates were scrambling to try to get troops up to their left flank because Lee realized he was in real trouble. Because if he lost the high ground that was west of the West Woods, which they call Hauser's Ridge because the Hauser farm was up there. Right. In fact, that's a really cool area you can go to now. It's part of the park. But that would be game over for defending the position that he was defending at Sharpsburg. He would have to retreat if they got that. So it was vital that he holds onto the West Woods, which provides cover and concealment and protection for the artillery batteries that are on Hauser's Ridge behind it. So the Confederates do a really good job of rushing reinforcements to the area. And then on the Union side, Sedgwick's division arrives, and they're led by their corps commander, Edwin Sumner, and their division commander, John Sedgwick. And they, the reason that they're coming in when they're coming in is McClellan, the way he fights the battle is, the one thing you have to understand about McClellan is he believes he's outnumbered in the battle, and he's taking a great risk in fighting an offensive battle. So when they send the First Corps in, he kind of waits to see, how's it, and then the 12th Corps goes in, he kind of waits to see how's things going. Are the enemy mounting a big counterattack? So he keeps all of what he considers his most trustworthy troops, the 2nd Corps, the 5th Corps, he also has the 9th Corps to the south, on the east side of Antietam Creek. Very good defensive position, right? And he knows the 6th Corps is coming on the field, another one of his Peninsula War veteran units. So if it turns out the enemy is baiting him and is going to mount a major attack against him, he's got a strong defensive position. But then he starts getting all these reports that Hooker is driving the enemy and things are going well. And meanwhile, Edwin Sumner, who's like a bull in a china shop, and he just wants to get going. He's like, if we're going to fight a battle, let's get everybody over there.
Right.
So ultimately, it's not till 7:20 a.m. So if the fighting starts at 5:30, it's almost 2 hours into the battle. McClellan makes the decision, I'll release the 2nd Corps, but only 2 of the 3 divisions, not all 3. So he's always hedging his bets that the enemy might mount a major counterattack. So he releases Sedgwick and French's division, and Sumner is so
chomping at the bit
to get there that he takes off with Sedgwick. They don't wait for French's division to catch up to them and get across Antietam Creek and so on. And when Sumner gets up to the East Woods area on the field, and with Sedgwick, he tries to assess the situation, and he doesn't do a very good job of gathering information about the forces that are there. So from what he can see with his own eyes, it looks like the 12th Corps is just dispersed. He sends a staff officer to find somebody in the 1st Corps who can give him a status report. And unfortunately, he runs into James Ricketts, who was a division commander, was somewhat demoralized. And Ricketts tells the staff officer, I can't raise 300 men of the entire Corps. So it sounds like the 1st Corps is shot. So if you're Sumner, you're thinking they weren't. That was not true. A lot of times in battles, people kind of lose their cool, get rattled. And I think Ricketts was rattled at this point. 1st Corps wasn't going to spearhead any attack, but they could support one. And Alpheus Williams, who now is in command of the 12th Corps because Mansfield's been mortally wounded, he comes up and he actually talks to Sumner. But he writes in this letter to his daughter, he's like, Sumner wasn't really interested in what I had to say. And as I write in the book, Sumner's faced with a kind of a dilemma. He has these orders from McClellan to try to press the attack. Now, those will be modified once he actually starts to move, because then McClellan got word that Hooker was wounded, Mansfield was mortally wounded, and then he started to think, maybe things aren't going as well as I think they're going. Sumner, I want you to be very careful. But Sumner's not going to get that message, or until disaster is struck. So Sumner is faced with kind of a dilemma. Do I push into the West Woods at once with Sedgwick's division, or do I wait, try to organize as many of the 1st Corps and 12th Corps troops as I can and their artillery to support a movement, and wait for French's division to come up? Well, he makes a decision, and I don't in the book, I don't say he's right or wrong. He's forced to make a decision. He makes the decision, I'm going to send Sedgwick in there. We need to get those woods before the enemy gets a hold of them. I want to get the woods. Where he then blunders is that instead of he remaining at the southern edge of the East Woods, which was a fantastic command point because he had a really good field of view of many things, and he could have coordinated and commanded all the different forces who are there. He's the senior officer on the whole field. He rides ahead with the leading brigade of Sedgwick's division, like a battalion commander, right? So he's riding along with it. And they get to the Hagerstown Pike. When they get to Hagerstown Pike, Sumner looks back behind him, and he doesn't see Sedgwick's other 2 brigades, because Sedgwick had been advancing in a formation the Army called column of brigades. And all that means is the leading brigade deploys all of its regiments in line of battle, one right next to the other. So the front line will be like 600 yards long, 2 ranks deep. That's your leading brigade. And then 50 to 60 yards behind that would be the next brigade. 50, 60 yards behind that would be the next brigade. That's a column of brigades. That's what they call that. So when they get to the Hagerstown Pike, Sumner looks behind. He doesn't see the other 2 brigades. And he's like, Sedgwick, he's like, where are your other 2 brigades? And Sedgwick says, very sensibly, you don't want them up here. Meaning, question mark. You don't want them up here. Like, what Sedgwick is saying in as a nice a way as he can is, sir, don't you think we should go into the woods, find out what the strength is,
and then
see where their
them.
force is, and then we can move our reserve brigades where they're needed?
Right.
And Sumner goes, no, I want them up here. Bring them up. So Sedgwick is forced to send a staff officer back. He brings the other 2 brigades up. As one of the guys in the brigade in the second line writes, he says, I could take my arm and reach forward and touch the men in the first line. That's how close together.
So it's just a mob.
They're it's not so much a mob, it's lines all stacked very close to each other.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what ends up happening is the mass of the Confederate attack strikes the left flank of the Union force of Sedgwick's division, and then it is a disaster.
Right.
I mean, it is just an absolute disaster.
Is it that the Union troops are too bunched together to be able to maneuver to meet that threat?
They can't maneuver to meet the threat. It creates a tremendous amount of confusion, and the only way they can escape the disaster is what Sumner ultimately starts yelling to his men to do. He says, move by the right flank. And what that means is if you're facing forward, you turn right and run that way. Okay. That's what he means. Okay. So move by the right flank. That would be language a Civil War soldier would understand. Go that way to the right. If you're facing forward, go to the right. That's the only way you can get out of it. You also had some atrocious leadership on the third line by Oliver Otis Howard, who personally is an extremely brave man. Yeah. But he was confronted with a lot of evidence that the left flank of the Union line was being hit hard. And he, in fact, his colonel of the 71st, Isaac Wister, I think that was his first name. He wrote the Virginian after the Civil War. Okay. He commands the 71st Pennsylvania, and he can see what's going on. And he goes to Howard. He says, sir, shouldn't we, I forget what he said, left oblique or wheel to the left or something to orient the brigade so that the men could use their weapons against the greatest threat to them? And Howard doesn't do it because Howard doesn't think there's a threat there. And he doesn't bother to inform himself until it's too late. And then at that point, the only thing his brigade can do is run for their lives. And then they take horrendous losses. Some of the units in his brigade perform really heroic duty by, fighting the rear guard actions to try to keep the Confederates back off of them. But one of the soldiers who was in the 72nd Pennsylvania, he wrote the most in the entire book, I think. It may be one of the most damning things of command that I encountered in researching this book. He was writing, this is a private letter he's writing after the war. He says, any non-commissioned officer in the 72nd Pennsylvania could have handled the brigade better that day than it was. So,
it's a little harsh.
And then, ended up with people like Sedgwick. He rides into the midst of when the 7th Michigan and the 42nd New York, the 42nd New York are just getting shot to pieces. And he's trying to help extricate them. He gets shot 3 times and is able to stay in the saddle and rides off the field. One of his brigade commanders, Gorman, he gets hit. It's just, and the thing is, when I was writing these chapters, you can't help, even though you know what's going to happen, wishing it doesn't happen.
Right.
Because you know what's going to happen. And These are some of the best regiments in the Army of the Potomac. Sedgwick's division is one of the best divisions in the Army.
Yeah.
They're really well trained. They're veteran soldiers. They're really good, but they're a classic example of if the leaders don't serve them right and make the right tactical decisions, a lot of people are going to die.
There's a quote you have from Sedgwick in there from a previous battle, I believe. I think it was Sedgwick, or it might have been Sumner, somebody. And he says that, he realizes that his men, they're not really down with the cause. You know what I'm talking about?
It was Sedgwick.
It was Sedgwick.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, it just made me think of that. Is it that if their leaders are good, then they'll be like, all right, I'm down with the cause today. But it's not really the cause that they're down with. They're just, down with getting down with this leader because he's a good leader.
Yeah.
That's got to be tough to lead men who are not fighting as fervently with the same amount of passion for why they fight as your enemy is doing.
Yeah. The thing is, you find both armies have these same issues. And what it comes down to is these soldiers who are overwhelmingly volunteers, they know that they've volunteered to fight in a war, and they know the war is going to be dangerous, and they know that people are going to die and get wounded and get captured, and those things are going to happen to them. What they ask from their leaders is that there's a purpose. So that a soldier, say in the 6th Wisconsin, could afterwards say, that was an incredibly tough fight. The Confederates fought really, really well, really tough. But so did we. And, we both got hurt bad, but we can hold our head high. I mean, we fought the good fight. If you were one of Sedgwick's men, now some of you, they had such a high opinion of Sumner, a lot of them didn't really realize that they didn't know. They knew that they had been handled badly. They didn't know who was responsible.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you did know, then you start to question, what are we fighting for here? What are we dying for? I mean, they're just going to use us like this, like cattle, and we're just going to get slaughtered? I'm not down with it. So you find there's a great story from Norman Hall. He was the colonel of the 7th Michigan in the Battle of Antietam. He becomes a brigade commander at Fredericksburg. And at Fredericksburg, there's a famous story. They were trying to put the pontoon bridges down across the Rappahannock, and the Barksdale's brigade had all these sharpshooters who were picking off the engineers. So ultimately, they got to the point. They bombarded Fredericksburg, which everybody freaked out about because nobody had ever done anything like that in America before. To try to dislodge them. Of course, like all bombardments, it didn't work. And then they had to put guys in pontoon boats and row them across the Antietam under fire, or across the Rappahannock under fire, and clear out these people. So Norman Hall, his 7th Michigan, one of his other regiments, I think it was the 20th Massachusetts.
19th and 20th, I think.
Yeah, they execute this movement. Then Hall writes a letter after the Battle of Fredericksburg, because Fredericksburg, we know, is a debacle.
Yeah.
He says, my men will never do that again.
So he's not going to issue the order.
Well, he's just saying that he could issue the order, but his men aren't going to do it.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
They're not going to do it because they felt they had been sacrificed in the battle without any real cause. So you think about the Army of the Potomac, they lose 23,000 men in the Battle of Gettysburg, but you don't really read anybody after the Battle of Gettysburg viewing Gettysburg as, my God, I can't believe they just wasted us the way they did. They all felt like we won the battle, we fought a really tough army, and we might win the war.
Mm-hmm.
So victory breeds confidence in your cause and in your willingness to accept risk.
It's easy to overlook things when you win.
It is. And when you have disasters, there's some Confederate units like Thomas Drayton's brigade. Well, a better example is it was a brigade commanded by Sam Garland at the Battle of South Mountain. It was a North Carolina brigade. And Garland was a really good brigade commander. He gets mortally wounded at South Mountain. He dies that day. And the commander who takes over is the senior colonel Duncan McCrae of the 5th North Carolina. He is roundly hated. Nobody has any confidence in him. He like constantly getting in arguments and things like that, and picayune fights with different people, and he's constantly battling over his rank, and he should be a general, and he's just and then they also criticize him because they in North Carolina they said he was whatever political party he thought would get him elected. So nobody really knew what his convictions were. Anyway, so in the Battle of Antietam, the brigade, which took a lot of casualties at South Mountain and had a really bad experience, his brigade goes into the East Woods to support some other Confederate units that were in the woods. And when they get into the woods, everybody's talking about how the brigade is like really nervous. It's like rippling through the unit. They're just like, they just don't feel confident, right? They don't have confidence in their leadership. They don't have confidence in their position. They're probably remembering their experience from 3 days before. And then finally, this captain on the right flank of the brigade says in a really loud voice, he says, "Look yonder, there's an entire Yankee brigade flanking us." And in the twinkling of an eye, the brigade stampeded from the field. They just like took off.
Yeah.
And it was about 750 men. And Duncan McCrae, writing after the war about this, he says, it was unaccountable. He said, I had no idea how this could have happened. But the thing is, what happened was, it's not that McCrae's brigade was a bad unit. McCrae's brigade reflected a lack of confidence in its leadership, the beating that they had taken on September the 14th, the loss of a leader that they respected. Mm-hmm. They were in a position they were not sure was defensible. They thought maybe they'd get flanked like they had been at South Mountain. So everybody's nervous and on edge, and they didn't have the sort of leadership that kind of calmed the men. Mm. They're like, okay, no, we're not. But so this is the thing, is that a lot of times people, they get their favorite unit, and they're like, oh, they're always great, or they were always bad, or these guys were good, and these guys were bad. And I'm like, well, some units they were good and bad. It depended on their leadership as the war went on. They might, and sometimes you had, like the 102nd New York was a regiment that I found really interesting. They were in the 12th Corps. One of the fellows, he was the senior captain in the regiment at Antietam. He ended up becoming the colonel, I believe. And he was really, really highly respected in the unit. In fact, everybody in the regiment looked to him for leadership because the colonel, this guy writes, he says the colonel was an incubus, which is like an evil spirit.
Right.
Right. So anyway, nobody had any confidence in this colonel. In fact, this captain wanted to file charges against the colonel for cowardice at Antietam, and he was talked out of it by his division commander. And this colonel ends up going all the way into the Atlanta campaign before he finally has to resign. So it's really interesting. Like, you'll find these other things where what held that unit together? Well, it was actually probably their senior captain who was respected and kind of gave the leadership that they needed, because their colonel wasn't going to give them that leadership that they needed. And everybody kind of knew it, but they had somebody else. Whereas in other units, they may not have anybody else that's respected by the whole unit.
It reminds me of in Band of Brothers when they're in Bastogne and they have Lieutenant Dyke, the guy from, and really it's Sergeant Lipton that's the leader while Dyke is in command.
That's right.
It's it's a leader, regardless of his rank, is going to rise to the top when needed.
Right.
So an old friend of mine has an ancestor who was in the 125th Pennsylvania, and he was killed in the first 20 minutes there. Cunningham was his name. I think I want to say it was Company C, but I don't remember what company he was in. But I think he's buried there at the National Cemetery. Although we went and looked years ago and couldn't find him, but then later I think she found out that he is buried there. So I'm particularly interested in the 125th. Can go into what they went through there, because as you mentioned before, they're in a month. They just got mustered in August, And so this is their first time at bat is the Battle of Antietam.
Yeah.
And they're on the right flank, right?
Yeah.
And what happens?
They were fortunate in that they had a really good colonel, Jacob Higgins. Higgins was a Mexican War veteran. I cannot remember. He may have been in a Pennsylvania cavalry regiment early in the war. But anyway, he was an experienced soldier. So he knew soldiering, and he knew what to do as a colonel. For example, some units like the 128th Pennsylvania, their colonel who gets killed, his name was Crosdale, he gets killed. Their colonel, 4 days before the Battle of Antietam, he was speaking with Ezra Carman, and he asked Ezra Carman, he says, "What are the orders that you give form line of battle?" So this is the colonel of a regiment that's going to be really heavily engaged. And I mean, the major in his regiment, 3 weeks before, had been the mayor of Reading, Pennsylvania. I mean, they didn't know what they were doing when they were there. Higgins knew what he was doing. He was a good soldier, and he had a chance to do some drilling with his men. So the men would have had some familiarity with, right face, left face, right flank, left flank, some of those sorts of things, go from column to line. They may have performed some of those maneuvers. They weren't proficient at any of that, but they may have known what they were doing. Unlikely they had ever fired their weapons.
Not even in practice?
Unlikely.
No.
Might have, but unlikely.
Okay.
They'd handled them, but they probably had not fired them yet. So, I mean, if they did, they had really limited experience with firearms.
Okay.
Really limited experience. So they end up kind of following behind when the 12th Corps, what they tried to do, the 12th Corps commanders tried to keep the new regiments kind of out of the way if they could, and use them to support movements because they were all afraid of what they would do when they would lose a lot of men. So the 125th kind of followed behind the advance of the 12th Corps when they broke the Confederate line about 8:30 in the morning and drove them back into the West Woods and beyond. So the 125th moved up to near the Dunkard Church to support a Union artillery battery there. And they laid down in that area, and then they got an order from their brigade commander, Samuel Crawford, who won no laurels at the Battle of Antietam. Crawford sends an order for Higgins to advance his regiment alone, unsupported, with no promise of help into the West Woods near the Dunkard Church.
Okay.
So Higgins is smart enough to know, like, this seems like a really bad idea for me to go in there alone. So he's going to send somebody from the regiment back to try to get some help for him. So he goes into the West Woods. And if you visit Antietam and you go to the Dunkard Church, you walk by the Dunkard Church, and there's a little road that runs just north of the church back through the West Woods. Well, if you walk on that road, you'll eventually come to the 125th Pennsylvania Monument. And it is where they were on this plateau. So from the Dunkard Church, when you go west of it or northwest of it, there's like a little plateau, and then the ground drops off through the woods. So they advanced up, not to the edge of the plateau, just back a little bit from the plateau, which was a smart position because if you're on the edge, everybody can see you.
Right.
You're back a little bit. They got to get close to you.
Get up to you.
And Higgins sent his skirmish line down forward into the woods, and then they end up making contact with the Confederates. And to make a long story short, ultimately, as more and more Confederate troops begin to arrive, the 125th starts to come under a tremendous amount of pressure. They do get some supports. The 34th New York arrived, which was a veteran unit from Sedgwick's division that arrived on their left flank to help protect their left flank. And they did have some protection a little ways away on their right. But ultimately, the Confederates, they just maneuvered so well in that fighting in the West Woods. They get into a position, they just deliver this crushing fire on the 125th, and the whole regiment just dissolves.
Yeah.
And
who was it? Who are the Confederate units?
It was G.T. Anderson's brigade.
Right,
it was part of Barksdale's brigade. It was Kershaw's brigade.
So they're just getting everybody.
Part of Jubal Early's brigade. Yeah, they had a lot of, but the Confederates just maneuvered so well. They were really, really good. The way they maneuvered under fire is impressive. and gained positions from which they had the advantage in delivering their fire. So they could deliver all their fire. You might only be able to deliver part of your fire back at them.
Right.
So you're going to lose that battle every time.
Was it? I was there a few years ago, and I seem to remember that the monument's in kind of an opening. It's like, was it open like that at the time?
It was wooded.
It was wooded.
It was
the
wooded,
whole place.
but it was a woods like one of the people who came there right after the battle. He said you could drive a carriage through the woods.
Okay.
So it was that sort of woods.
Right. With no undergrowth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Confederates, they're coming up. They're malnourished, I guess.
Some of them.
A good. Okay. Some of them.
Some of them were.
Not to bring this down to a 12-year-old's level, but I was I was reading in the an environmental history of the Civil War. Have you read that?
No, I haven't, but I've heard about it.
It's good. It's a short read. It's very interesting. And they're talking about how there were people who, I guess, after the battle, it was a civilian account, I believe, who said that you could you could make out where the battle lines were by the green, basically diarrhea on the grass. That they would, leave the firing line, drop trow, do what they had to do, and then go back on the firing line. So part of the reason Lee's coming up here is the same reason he's coming up to Gettysburg the next year, is to resupply, correct?
Not really.
Oh, no.
He has to resupply. So the reason he's coming into Maryland is he wants to get into Pennsylvania, but it's political and military. So he has political objectives using military means to achieve them. And the military means are by bringing his army into the north, into Maryland and Pennsylvania. He places immense pressure on the Lincoln administration. He embarrasses the administration. He makes the administration look impotent. It makes the Union war effort look like it can't ever possibly win this war. But when he does this, there's a difference between 1862 and 63.
Okay.
And that in 1862, when Lee goes into Maryland, they're still pretending that Maryland, being a slave state, really actually wants to be a part of the Confederacy, but they're being prevented by the Lincoln administration. Lee's going to learn the truth that isn't the case. That is not what they want to be. There's only a small part of the state, and it's mainly the eastern part of the state where the people who have the enslaved population live, who would want to be in the Confederacy.
Okay.
The part of Maryland that he's in, they don't want to be part of the Confederacy.
So not a lot of slaves out there.
Like Washington County, Maryland, it was about 50-50. About 50% free, 50% slave. But whenever you have a situation like that, it becomes very difficult for the slave holder. So example, Henry Piper owns a farm. There's a lot of fighting around his farm.
Yeah.
And Henry Piper has an enslaved individual and a free African-American individual on his farm. So you can imagine what sort of accommodations does Henry Piper have to make with the enslaved person to make sure he does the things Henry Piper needs him to do. It's going to be different than if Henry Piper is living somewhere down deep in Mississippi or South Carolina or Georgia or Alabama, where he doesn't have to worry about another person on his place is not enslaved. They're all enslaved.
Right.
So it's there's a great book about Maryland as the middle ground in slavery, that it's this dilemma that a lot of these slave holders confront because there are a lot of free people. Their slavery is beginning to die. It's easy for them to run away as well, right? Even though people say it's easy to run away, for enslaved people, it really wasn't easy because you think about it, you're like, okay, well, where are you going to go?
Exactly.
Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? How are you going to find food? You're an African-American person in a white person's world.
Stick out like a sore thumb.
Stick out.
Yeah.
And so it was a really risky thing. But anyway, that was an issue. So when Lee comes into Maryland in 62, he wants to make sure the Marylanders are like, you know what? We're going to treat you really nicely. We're not going to seize supplies from you. We're not going to, disrupt your life. We're going to respect your choice is up to a point. We will still fight battles in your backyard. But, anyway, so you see that Lee's army is really well disciplined in Maryland for the most part. I mean, you can always find cases of soldiers getting out of hand and
Sure.
causing depredations because Lee had over 20,000 stragglers in Maryland.
So that's where I'm getting at. Go ahead, keep going.
So the crux of the problem is that so Lee is in the Maryland, the Confederate logistics just simply don't exist. So there's no system of getting regular supplies to the army, clothing, food, equipment, stuff like that.
Do you mean when you're saying that? Do you mean before they left, when they're back in Virginia, or
in
even,
Northern Virginia?
So even back home, they don't have an effective way of.
If if he had been down near Warrenton, Virginia, yes, because the only way you're going to supply an army of the size of Lee's is by the railroad.
Sure,
it's the only way you're going to do it. Now you can be, let's say, 20 miles away from a railhead, and you can funnel supplies up by wagon. But the Confederates are always short of transportation. A lot of their transportation is breaking down, so on. So when Lee goes into Maryland, he's like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to pay for the food that we need to take, and we'll be able to feed ourselves when we get there. And then he gets into the state, and the people are like, we don't want your money. And we don't want to sell you food. So then they have this big dilemma, and it's, there's one example I always remember from the first book is when they first crossed into Maryland, D.H. Hill's division, or one of his brigades had marched up to near Frederick, and Hill made this negotiation with a farmer, and he bought one of his cornfields. So he told this brigade, or maybe it was a couple of brigades, he's like, fall out and get your rations. So, I mean, that's some of the way. So it was very haphazard, the way a lot of men were trying to be fed. It wasn't like when Lee came into Pennsylvania, he had a whole system. They would just come in to, say, Gettysburg, and they'd say, here's what we need. Right. Here's the list. Right. Get it now. So or we're going to take it out on you.
Were those mistakes that they learned from Antietam, or was it just?
It's just that Lee realized after the Maryland campaign, when he had so many problems trying to keep his army fed, and he ended up with huge numbers of stragglers as a result, because they're making hard marches. So these men are using up a lot of calories trying to make these marches and fight battles and so on, and they're not getting fed. So guys just straggled. They just went off to try to find something to eat. So when he comes into Pennsylvania in 63, he's like, when we go through Maryland and Pennsylvania, we're just impounding what we need. Okay. We're seizing it. Got it. We'll give them an itemized list, and they can try to file a claim against the Confederate government after the war, but we're taking what we need. Right. So we're not playing this game anymore where we're acting like you're our friends. Right. And, yeah. Right.
So were there cases of desertion because some men felt, I signed up to defend the South, not invade?
No. That's a story that's been told many, many times, that the Confederates, a lot of Confederate soldiers, did not want to go into the North because they felt that they had enlisted to defend the South. And right. I found one account of all the Confederate accounts. One account mentioned that a Confederate regiment from Western North Carolina, which was lukewarm about secession to begin with, men in that regiment, when they got to the Potomac, are like, what are we doing here? And maybe a couple of guys bugged out, but they just kind of bitched about it, and then they went across. Most soldiers, if they wrote anything contemporary, were really enthusiastic. They were like, yeah, baby, let's take the war to him, man. This is great. General Lee is what a campaign. He's like Caesar and Napoleon. We're going to win. Okay. We're winning. Yeah. So they were, what I found was there was a lot of enthusiasm amongst those who were fit enough to make the crossing. Now, when Lee gets up to Leesburg, Virginia, he did a shakedown of his army because soldiers who didn't have shoes, we know at least in Longstreet's command, an order was issued that any soldiers who didn't have shoes were excused from going into Maryland. And one soldier, maybe a couple of guys, wrote that some of the soldiers threw their shoes away because they were like, I don't want to do any more of this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of that actually, but what I do know is that there were probably at least 5,000 men that were determined not fit to go into Maryland. They formed them up into provisional brigades and marched them to Winchester, Virginia, where Lee was going to establish a depot, and he would hope that they would be able to get resupplied with shoes and some clothing and maybe a little bit of food, and then could funnel them up to him in Maryland or Pennsylvania, wherever he might be.
Okay.
So, yeah, he had at the beginning. So he has about 70,000 men when he gets up to Leesburg. So he sheds about 5,000. That's a division.
Yeah.
Then when he gets into Maryland, everywhere he moves in Maryland, and particularly once they start making really hard marches, they just leak soldiers by the hundreds along the roads. And some of it is just, it's not, like after Gettysburg, if you look at the Confederate Army during the retreat, there's a number of soldiers who desert or go AWOL temporarily, who've just lost faith in the cause.
Okay.
They gave everything they had at Gettysburg, and they're like, we're not going to win this. They hear about Vicksburg, and it just demoralizes them. I didn't find anybody that I found that wrote about it and that was like, I don't believe in the cause. They were like, I'm just worn out.
Right, just tired.
I just worn out.
So at that point, the cause was still very much alive for them, and give
Sure,
it one
yeah.
more try if we have to, or whatever.
Yeah, they were. They just had enough of soldiering.
Yeah,
You know, soldiering had turned out to be unbelievably hard, and they're like, I'm not doing this anymore because I'm not getting any food, and I'm going to die.
yeah,
And I'm just going to hang out at this farmhouse. So when there's a chapter in the back of the book called Recovery. It's about how the Army in Northern Virginia recovers from the Battle of Antietam, because the Army was really, really badly hurt at Antietam, badly hurt. And so one of the things they do is they put on these, it's like a hunting drive using cavalry and some infantry in the lower end of the Shenandoah Valley. And they just put these drives on. And they roused out of farmhouses and people's homes and woods and all that. Hundreds and hundreds of men, 20,000 men ultimately, who were stragglers that they bring back to the Army.
Wow.
In the weeks after the Battle of Antietam. So Lee had tons of soldiers. He writes about it a lot to Jefferson Davis about all these depredations these soldiers are committing because there's no real law and they're desperate. So they're using their weapons to make sure they get food or they get lodging. And it's just amazing how many soldiers Lee had. And then he had a lot of sick men, because what happened was the Confederacy had started conscription in the spring of '62.
Right.
So he was getting a fair number of conscripts to his army, but he actually writes this letter, I think it was to Davis or it was the Secretary of War, that don't send us any more conscripts right now because they're all sick. They're all getting these diseases, and they're ending up filling our hospitals, and we're overwhelmed with them. And we don't have the transportation to evacuate them. The Yankees are going to come in and parole them. And then if they parole them, they can't serve for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
So, he, Lee had a boatload of problems afterwards, but it's pretty remarkable how he turned it all around.
So what would you say his effective fighting force was at the battle? Like 50,000?
Oh, it was a little bit below 40. It was about 39,000 men.
Wow. And then what of his whole force, how much did McClellan commit ultimately?
He committed, he has about, 70,000 fighting men, and he probably committed about 60,000. So he committed a fair number.
Yeah. So, wow, it's amazing that the Confederates were able to.
Well, one of the things that Lee did, first off, Antietam, even though he doesn't entrench, Antietam is a pretty good defensive position.
Yeah, it is.
But the other thing that Lee did really, really skillfully is he constantly massed his forces, and he uses artillery really effectively at the point that was the most threatened.
Right.
So if you were a soldier in Sedgwick's division and you walked out of that battle and you said, did you guys outnumber the Confederates in that battle? You, oh, no. They had way more men than we did.
Right.
Way more. I mean, I saw it with my own eyes.
Right.
I saw it with my own eyes. So even all the way down, let's say you're in the Ninth Corps. I mean, when the Ninth Corps first attacks, they smash the brigades of D.R. Jones' division, which are down south of Sharpsburg. But then they get counterattacked by A.P. Hill's division, and it seems like there's just Confederates coming out of everywhere.
Right.
But the reality is, if you counted up all the Ninth Corps soldiers, there were more of them than there were Confederates. It's that the Confederates concentrated at the most vulnerable point. So even though you had more men, like with Sedgwick, you're out of position.
Yeah.
So the enemy gets you in a vulnerable thing, and the only thing you can do is fall back. And when you start to fall back, they take a terrible toll on you when you're trying to retreat. So
and Lee's got interior lines.
Right, exactly.
So and they're what from end to end is what? From flank to flank.
Maybe 3 miles.
3 miles. So basically what Meade has here.
Yeah.
And so we see here how well that works. So obviously it's going to work for him there too.
Yeah.
And McClellan, he's got to cross creeks. And I mean, it's not an easy way. That's the one thing when I go and visit there, I'm like, I would not want to be McClellan. I would not want to be any of his commanders, because to get to the Confederates is a slog. And then to fight them, and like you point out, they're on good ground for defense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that...
he's able to... the Confederates didn't defend the upper bridge, is what they call it. So there's the upper bridge, the middle bridge, and the lower bridge, which was also the Rohrbach Bridge, and they call it Burnside's Bridge today. But the upper bridge wasn't defended. So they were able to cross over that with no resistance on September 16th with the First Corps. So he knew that he could, and that's why he launched his attack against the Confederate left, is the Union right Confederate left was the area that had the most ground for being able to maneuver a large number of troops and mount a major attack. So that's why he makes his major attack there. But if you were Lee, this is the advantage that McClellan has, because when Lee makes the decision, I'm going to defend, then he surrenders the initiative.
Mm-hmm.
So the point I always make to people is that Lee has the initiative when he makes the decision to fight a battle at Sharpsburg. He makes the decision. He could have retreated across the Potomac River,
right,
and there wouldn't have been a battle.
Right.
He makes the decision, I'm going to fight this battle. But then when he subsequently makes the decision, I feel I have to fight this battle defensively, then McClellan has the initiative. So if you're Lee, you have to stay strong on your right flank, because the lower bridge is the closest avenue the enemy have to cutting off your line of retreat to the Potomac River and Bottler's Ford. You cannot lose that. You can't lose it. You cannot let the enemy get through there. So you have to stay strong there. So McClellan can mass his strength. Lee has to be strong pretty much everywhere on his front, because there's a possibility that he's probably going to hit me on my left, but he may hit me on the right. So I better stay strong down there. So it's a very difficult battle for Lee to manage, and Lee manages it extremely decisively. McClellan, he gets a lot of criticism for the Battle of Antietam. I have kind of a mixed feeling about McClellan. He makes a lot of mistakes in the battle. He does do a number of things right. You have to give him credit for the fact that he attacks in the battle.
Sure.
He does attack. He attacks across his entire front. But he does make, and I think some of this has to do with who he is. So he's always thinking he's outnumbered. So when you're outnumbered, you're going to make a lot of decisions that are going to be very cautious. He is not experienced in managing an offensive battle. Even when people go, well, he was at the Battle of Williamsburg, he was at the, Seven Pines, he was in the 7 Days battles. I'm like, he didn't really command the army in any of those battles. He came on the field at the end of Williamsburg. He claimed a lot of credit for Williamsburg, but he didn't really manage the battle.
Okay.
He didn't really manage the Battle of Seven Pines. He didn't manage the Battle of Gaines's Mill. He kind of let the battle just run its course. He left his corps commanders to just kind of fend for themselves at Savage Station, Glendale, White Oak Swamp. At Malvern Hill, subordinate officers basically deployed all the troops and he had picked the position with the help of some of his topographical engineers. So when he gets to South Mountain and Antietam, I mean, he's not an experienced battle commander. He's been present. He's been the Army commander, but he's not the guy. He's not like Lee making a lot of battlefield decisions. So Antietam was one of the first times he really is making a lot of battlefield decisions. And some of those decisions that he makes, we can look back on them in hindsight and go, that was the wrong move. But I think you do always have to be temper your criticism of him, because you have to see the battle through his eyes. And when you see the battle that he thinks he's outnumbered and he's taking a great risk in fighting this battle, well, you can say, yeah, his intelligence service sucked. It did. It was terrible.
Yeah.
Right? Joe Hooker said, he said it when he took command of the Army in January of 1863. So he's referring to both Burnside and McClellan. He said, we had no more idea of the strength and organization of the Army of Northern Virginia than if they'd been in China.
So and that was the Pinkertons then, right?
That was the Pinkertons. But the other thing, the other problem you had at McClellan's headquarters is that, and this happens, as you read through history, you find this happen frequently at military headquarters, and it also happens in political decision making. So you start to believe whatever it is you want to believe is the truth, and you start to seek the intelligence that reinforces that belief and discount the intelligence that doesn't. So, you know, the one example I can think of in modern times is the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So the administration at the time was seeking out the information that supported the Iraqis had WMDs and we need to go in there and so on. And then you had this task force that was associated with the Army War College that was looking at the potential of this, and they're like, this is a really, really bad idea. And there's also very little evidence that we have that's reliable. They have WMDs. Well, you can discount that because you've got other evidence that you want to believe. So if you're at McClellan's headquarters, what ultimately is going to happen, and I saw this actually in the sort of reports that officers were sending in, you began to understand that they think these inflated numbers are true. So they would report ridiculous numbers to headquarters of numbers of Confederate soldiers that might be, you know, reported in this place or that place. And I think the Pinkerton was doing the same thing. He knew kind of what headquarters wanted, and he was fulfilling the need of what they wanted. So what you need, and what a commander, if a lesson you're going to learn from this is like, look, you're going to have your own prejudices, but the one thing you can't ever do is apply them to your intelligence officers. They have to speak truth to you.
Right.
So, and I think, you know, for example, Lee was very good at that in gathering intel, but he was also good at encouraging his subordinates to speak truth to him, like Jeb Stuart and others. Grant was also good in that respect. So that they, you know, because Lee is outnumbered in almost every battle he fights in the war.
Right.
That doesn't deter him from taking the offensive or fighting a battle. McClellan, on the other hand, it does deter him sometimes from fighting a battle or how he fights a battle, because he constantly is believing that he's outnumbered. And I'm one of those people, I went through for a long time, like, he can't actually believe this stuff. He can't. I mean, he's just saying it because he's trying to get reinforcements to his army. But ultimately, over many, many years working on this and looking at enough evidence, it finally sunk through my thick head. I'm like, no, he did.
He believed it.
He actually believed it.
Yeah. I think, folks, if you haven't already gotten these books, this is like Coddington on steroids, but not boring to read. That's the thing. Is like a lot of times when you get something that's got a lot of information, it's hard to read because it's like just really dry. But this is not dry at all. A lot of good. If you like the individual soldier stories and things like that, then there's a lot of that in here. It's got a little bit of everything. There's a little bit of everything. And here's something I noticed too. I mean, how many pages is this?
970.
900 something. And the other one's about the same?
A little bit less.
A little bit less?
Yeah.
Look at how small the writing is. Okay? There is a lot of information crammed into the... It's not 900, with font size of 12 and everything. Like this is tiny writing and not a lot of pictures. I would suggest, would you suggest this too, that somebody get like Gottfried's Maps of Antietam book or something, have it alongside?
You could.
Yeah, because there's maps in here.
The maps, Hal Jesperson did the maps, and he did a fantastic jobs on the maps. The maps are based upon the Carmen maps.
Okay.
So you're basically seeing the Carmen maps without all the busyness of the Carmen maps. So Hal did a phenomenal job on that. But one of the things with Hopkins, they're a fantastic publisher. I love them. But, this is not a knock against them at all, they limit how many graphics, photographs, maps you can have in a book.
Oh, really?
So that's why there's very few pictures in the book, because I felt it was very important that you have a lot of maps. So I tried to have a map for every battle chapter and the chapter about the Battle of Shepherdstown in there. So that, but it's like any book like this. I mean, I've read books where, I'm constantly trying to find that map back in there.
Yeah.
So if you have an atlas that you can have beside you, sometimes that can be really helpful.
There you go.
Because you don't have to go back to the map in this book.
Yeah, I had my one finger in the map page.
Yes.
And then I go back and forth. Because it's hard to keep track, especially the Western Woods. It's very confusing.
Yes.
There's a lot of movement and troops coming in. And troops are already there, and troops recognizing these guys coming, and they change their shift. Like a lot of stuff.
Well,
to keep track of.
One example about how a book doesn't write itself, but in some ways,
it'd be nice if it did.
It would be, but in other ways, the story tells the writer how much you need to tell that story. So what I mean by that is when I was going to write about Sedgwick's division, the attack into the West Woods, when I was first, planning out the chapters, I'm like, oh, that's one chapter. And then I started doing the research on it, and I was like, holy Toledo. This is really complex, and it's really big. It isn't just these guys march into the woods and they get ambushed. They weren't even ambushed, but they get hit in the flank, and then they get routed, and that's the battle. It was this huge sprawling battle that were attacks and counterattacks. And so it took me 3 chapters to tell the whole story, to tell it the whole story, so somebody could understand the whole context of how Sedgwick fits into what happens right after it and right before it, because you can't understand what happens to Sedgwick if you don't know those things.
Right.
So that's just one example that as I worked through this thing, you might think, oh, you're going to cover the Sunken Lane in one chapter. You're not going to cover it in one chapter. No. You can't tell the story you want to tell in the sort of richness you want and make one chapter. So,
yeah, I mean, you have To the West Woods.
Right.
And the next chapter is Disaster in the West Woods. I didn't even look to see what the one after it is. Is it?
I think it's like attack and counterattack, because there were all these attacks and counterattacks after Sedgwick's division gets routed.
Yeah, attack and counterattack.
Yeah.
So, I mean, several chapters in one area there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And most books, they'll just do the West Woods.
That's right.
And then that's one chapter.
Right. So what they'll do is what you end up doing when you do that, and there's no knock against people who do that, because you have to do what you have to do in writing a book. But
you also have to admit that what you've done is something abnormal.
Yes,
you've done this 20 years. It's 2 volumes. It's a comprehensive.
Yeah.
This is a big work. So this is an exception here.
It is. But I mean, what you end up doing is you have to kind of abstract or try to reduce some of the complexity so that, because you can't tell everything. And what ends up happening sometimes when you do that is what you are writing isn't necessarily the way it turned out, because it takes too long to explain all of that. So you try to condense it. But what ends up happening sometimes, and I've seen this in writings on Gettysburg and things I've even had to do where I have like this really limited amount of space, and you're like, well, there's a lot of stuff that informed this that I can't tell you.
Yeah.
But I do the best I can. And that's the thing that I was so thankful for with Hopkins with this, is they let me tell what I felt was the whole story. Yet I told the complete story. So it wasn't just the battle story. It's the aftermath of the battle as well, and the end of the campaign. And I wanted to tell this whole thing because it's the people who experienced it. This is how they experienced it. It wasn't this segregate. Oh, this is the battle, and then we don't need to worry about what happens after the battle. Like, no, they did have to worry about that.
Right.
That was also very much a part of the battle.
Yeah. Well, I think, I can't see how this isn't going to be on every Antietam Nerds library shelf. I mean, these are awesome. Chris, in the back there, do the listeners have any questions?
I have nothing here in the chat.
Okay.
I wrote down some questions.
You got some questions? Go ahead.
Couple.
Go ahead.
I guess just following up on the Pinkerton part of this. There's a famous picture of Lincoln, Pinkerton, and McClernand, I believe, after Antietam at the battlefield. Do you think at that time Pinkerton is still making McClellan's case with the inflated numbers?
He tried. He did go back. McClellan sent him back on kind of a spy mission to sound out Lincoln. And Lincoln's just so much smarter than all of these individuals. What Lincoln ended up doing in this meeting, because Lincoln was happy to meet with Pinkerton, is it ended up basically Lincoln interrogating Pinkerton. In Lincoln's way, I mean, one of the things Lincoln did that was really interesting, I found, there's a chapter in there about, that's the last chapter in the book where I write about the events that lead to McClellan being relieved of command. And Lincoln came out to visit the Army when that photograph was taken. It's the beginning of October of 1862. And he had two purposes. One, he wanted to see, what's going on here. I want to talk with the McClellan. I want McClellan to understand the political implications of his inactivity. So we have got to do something. We got to move. But the other reason he goes out there is he wants to sound out the corps commanders of the Army. Where's your loyalty? Is it to the government or is it to McClellan? So he's really, really clever in how he does this. Because if you read like the letters of William B. Franklin or Fitzjohn Porter or even Alpheus Williams, who really likes Lincoln, but he's like, he tells some good jokes. He's a nice guy. I just don't think he's the guy to lead us through this thing.
Yeah.
The brilliance of what Lincoln does. So if Lincoln comes in and you're the corps commander and he goes, all right, I want you to tell me, what do you think of the strength of the Confederate Army? What is your strength? He starts like Wall Streeting this guy, and hitting him with all these things. What are you going to do? You're going to just spill your beans? You're going to be defensive? You're going to be defensive.
Right.
So what Lincoln does, oh, shucks, the Army did all anyone could ever ask of it. You men have performed heroic duties. I mean, heroic duties. And so you start feeling good. You start, I'm just a simple country lawyer. I'm trying to do the best I can. I'm not sure I'm up to the whole task. But I'm wondering, if it comes down to it, where does your loyalty lie? Well, I said, sir, I just the United States of America. I mean, we all think McClellan's a great commander, but, we'll serve anybody because we serve the country. Well, he gradually figures out by talking to all these different commanders, he's like, their loyalty's with the country. So that was gold for Lincoln. So he walks away from visiting the Army knowing that if he relieves McClellan of command, he can do it.
Right.
And the Army is not going to have some sort of meltdown over it. And it ends up being right. I mean, it almost does have a meltdown parts of it, but it does work. So, yeah, I mean, so to get back to your question, Chris, I mean, Pinkerton does attempt to try to, sleuth out from Lincoln what's going on, what's the administration really want, but it ends up Lincoln sleuths out more from Pinkerton than Pinkerton gets from Lincoln.
You gotta love Lincoln. He was one of a kind.
He was.
I don't know if we've had anybody like him since.
He was. I mean, the thing about him is he was a brilliant guy. He was extremely smart, but he never lost sight of he was a vehicle to help save this country.
Yeah.
He was not the savior of the country.
Right. Right.
He never
right,
viewed
right.
himself. He never viewed himself in that way.
Yeah.
He always viewed himself as, I am the vehicle to try to achieve this. I will use any tools that I need to win.
Yeah.
So McClellan said all these terrible things about me. I don't care. If he can deliver victory, I'll use him. Joe Hooker says we need a dictator. I don't care. I'll tell Joe Hooker, hey, you deliver the victories. Let me worry about the dictatorship.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a humility to Lincoln that is so rare in people who seek high public office.
Very rare.
Very rare.
Yeah.
So
No, I mean, maybe it helps to come from humble beginnings, you know?
yeah.
What else you got, Chris?
Well, you know, there's the beginning of the film Glory,
Yes.
and there's a scene in there, and Pohanka was involved in sort of the chronological, I would imagine, of this film, and even plays a small part in it. But there's the part where the surgeon is tending to Robert Shaw, and it's right after the battle, and proclaims that he has heard through his connections that Lincoln has drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, is that possible timeline wise at that time?
No.
It was just
it's
Hollywood.
Hollywood kind of
Condensing.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
compressing that. Sure.
I mean, if it was a few days after the battle and Lincoln has issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, yes, then it's possible that Shaw would have heard about that. But it's probable that if it's the day of the battle or the day after the battle, they didn't know that he.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
they didn't even know he was going to issue it.
They're not worried about that
Right.
stuff.
Yeah, they're not worried about that at that
And
point.
no orderly at a hospital has got the time to catch up on the news.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, once he issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, I mean, everybody read about it,
Yeah.
and everybody had an opinion about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was discussed throughout the Army immediately.
Oh, I'm sure.
Afterwards,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So it was a really, really big deal. But you're not going to learn about it before it's actually issued.
right.
Yeah.
That I guess a more important question here would be: do you think McClellan deserved the scrutiny over the not committing his reserves in the area of the Newcomb House, of the middle bridge area, knowing what we know now, but also was that hill as formidable as East Cemetery Hill at Gettysburg, with kind of the opposite happening with the Confederates holding that Cemetery Hill there?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is just on the east side of Sharpsburg is where the town cemetery was. And today, on the opposite side of that is where the National Cemetery is. And that was referred to at the time in that area as Cemetery Hill. Now, to the north of Cemetery Hill is what I call Cemetery Ridge, because there's a ridge that runs north of it across the Boonesboro Pike to the north. That was every inch as formidable as Cemetery Hill at Gettysburg. Every inch as formidable. However, what happened there is that in the late morning, McClellan ordered the cavalry, which was a really weird order. He orders his cavalry to cross the middle bridge with the horse artillery and to engage the Confederate center. So you can understand what he's doing is what he's trying to do is a demonstration to make sure the Confederates don't withdraw any troops from his center. But the cavalry at that time period of the war, most of the regiments don't carry carbines and are not trained to fight on foot. So most
what are they, pistols and sabers?
Yeah. So they just hid. They hid underneath the bank of the creek. They hid behind a newcomer barn. They just hid because the Confederate artillery was firing.
Yeah.
And then the few units that did have the carbines went up to try to support the horse artillery batteries. They couldn't support them because their carbines didn't have the range. They were engaged by Confederate skirmishers. The artillery battery commanders started saying, we need infantry. We need infantry. And we saw a bunch of infantry across the creek. So eventually they kind of put the pressure on McClellan, who tells Fitzjohn Porter, send some infantry across the creek. So Porter tells George Sykes, commanding one of his divisions, send some of the regulars across. So Sykes sends some regulars across the creek. And ultimately, because of the skirmishing that goes on, he very reluctantly, because Sykes is another one of these guys who absolutely believes the Confederates outnumber the Union Army. And he's certain that they've got a big force behind Cemetery Hill. So he didn't want to send anybody across.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, he sends some more troops across, and he sends this one officer across who was the commander of the 4th U.S. Infantry, Captain Hiram Dreyer. He's one of the, completely forgotten to history. He dies in 1867 of pneumonia at a fort out in Kansas. I forget which one it was, Larned maybe. But Dreyer is an extraordinary leader. He's an extraordinary leader because what Dreyer understands is that the regulars have the discipline, the training, and the skills to do things that other troops can't do.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is they're very well trained in marksmanship, skirmishing, and very well disciplined. So what he does is he deploys the regulars as skirmishers, and then he keeps some of the regulars back in the line of battle, but far enough behind them that they can give support. But using a skirmish line, he clears Cemetery Ridge of all the Confederate infantry. He drives all the artillery off of the ridge.
Really?
He would have taken Cemetery Hill. I am certain of it. However, Sykes becomes aware of what Dreyer is doing, and he is exceeding his orders, and Sykes sends him, peremptory orders. You will withdraw your men at once. You were not authorized to make this movement. So it's an example of a commander, Sykes, and to some degree, his corps commander, Porter, not seeing an opportunity right before their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
It's right there.
Mm-hmm.
This is it. I'm not saying it's easy to do, but the great commanders do this. They see the opportunity, they see this moment, and they're like, we got to reinforce this. So instead of reinforcing Dreyer, they pull the regulars that are across the creek back, and the whole opportunity is lost. So could McClellan have reinforced this? Yes, he could have. I mean, again, it's a case of you need to see those opportunities when they arise. I don't know that McClellan was even aware of the opportunity that existed there until it was far too late to do anything about it. I would say McClellan's, the biggest movement that McClellan makes that shapes the fact that he's not going to win, a really big victory or decisive victory is when he makes the decision to send the 6th Army Corps to the right flank of the Army. Because the 6th Army Corps, they come up in the morning. They've come up from Pleasant Valley. They had broken through at Crampton's Gap, and then they kind of fiddled around down there for a while because their commander was super timid, William Franklin. He comes on the field. When he comes on the field, it's at a point in the battle that the disaster has occurred in the West Woods. And you have Edwin Sumner signaling you that he is afraid the entire right flank of the Army could be driven back into Antietam Creek. He is completely demoralized. You don't know that. Mm-hmm. All you know, he's my senior general. He's brave as a lion. And this guy's telling me that we're in desperate shape on the right flank, that all the forces over there could collapse and we could get driven back into Antietam Creek. And he makes the decision to send the 6th Corps to the right flank. Now, if he'd sent the 6th Corps to reinforce French and Richardson at the Sunken Lane, if he'd sent the 6th Corps across the Middle Bridge, if he'd sent the 6th Corps down to the 9th Corps, it might have changed the course of the battle because it would have infused 10,000 men in a spot on the battlefield where they would have really made a difference. What they end up doing is essentially assuming a defensive posture on the northern end of the battlefield, and they don't contribute in any way. But again, you understand the decision if you realize, if you're in McClellan's shoes, and I'm outnumbered. And if Lee launches a major counterattack and this calamity occurs that Edwin Sumner's saying is going to occur, and I don't reinforce that, I could lose the battle. Right. So I'm not going to lose the battle. I may not win it as I'd like to win it, but I'm not going to lose the battle. So I'm going to reinforce. So I don't criticize him as much because they did send a fair number of regulars across the creek. They did most of one brigade. But there were 3, 4, 5 other brigades of the 5th Corps who were available. But I do think McClellan did have to keep a reserve.
Oh, sure.
He did have
Yeah.
to keep a reserve because any commander is going to keep some reserve. So I don't criticize him for that. I think his decision of where he sends the 6th Corps is a monumental decision in the battle because as the Army commander, once the battle is really underway, the only way you influence the battle is by the committing of reserves.
Mm-hmm. On a scale of 1 to 10, McClellan as an Army commander, how do you rate him? Not just here, but at Antietam, but everywhere through his whole career.
Probably like a 6.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood. He's a pretty good strategist, and the other thing about McClellan that I give him a lot of credit for in the last chapter of the book is that he really was the only person available to the Union war effort that after the debacle at Second Manassas that could have inspired the Army to fight like they did at South Mountain and Antietam because the Army believed in him.
Yeah.
They did. They believed in him. And he immediately restored the morale. So that letter you referenced earlier about from John Sedgwick. So here's a guy. He's a West Point graduate. He's a regular Army soldier. He's tough. He's from Connecticut. He's a Yankee. But he's writing a letter after Second Manassas, and he goes, "I don't see any other way, but the Southern Confederacy is going to be recognized. We're going to lose this war."
Mm.
So this is what he's thinking. Then McClellan comes into command, and all of a sudden, Sedgwick's like, "Well, maybe it's not that bad."
Because he sees a change in the men.
Yeah, maybe, and then, of course, his division has a disaster at Antietam, but Antietam is ultimately an operational victory for the Union cause.
Right.
So that's the thing about these military these battles count. They count a lot because they have a huge impact upon the morale of the soldiers. So if they'd had another disaster at South Mountain and Antietam, guys like Sedgwick, they're your backbone of the Army because they're your professionals. If they lose faith, you're in trouble. If they regain the faith, so you can criticize McClellan all you want for some of the decisions that he makes, but he restores the morale of the Army, and that is really, really important. And that, again, we come back to Lincoln. You can criticize Lincoln and his decisions with his generals all you want, but, man, it is the right decision because McClellan is the guy who can restore the morale of the Army. He doesn't have anybody else who has that type of gravitas and relationship with the Army like McClellan does.
Scott Hartwig, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Chris, thank you for your help in the back there.
You got it.
I hope I didn't make you too late for your appointments.
No, good.
And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. You can get this anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazon,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
For the historian, I'm sure. You use your
Yeah.
20% discount there as a listener here. And let us know what you think about it when you finish. It's going to take me probably about 20 years to finish this at the rate that I read. But I look forward to the next 20 years doing that. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. We'll talk to you next time. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Would you sign this, please?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And then don't forget, you have to sign my Wall of Fame as well.
Oh, right, yeah.
Very important.
Yeah. Whoops.
Oh, sorry.
Got it.
The